Well, good evening again, everybody. I thought I'd spend the next few minutes talking about one of the presidents that are towering over us here this evening. Actually, number one, our first president, George Washington. You know, after winning the Battle of Yorktown, after winning the Revolutionary War, praise poured in for George Washington. But I tend to think that the most telling words ever said about the man were not said in praise, they were not said to glorify him, they were spoken simply as a statement of fact by another very famous man of that revolutionary era. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and after almost conquering all of Europe, he finally lost his wars. They exiled him out into an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was there where he died. But while he was lying on his deathbed, he uttered the words, "They wanted me to be another Washington." When I first read that, it really kind of blew me away. Why did he say that at that time? And what was the quality in Washington that he was talking about? I don't think he was talking about Washington's military genius, because the truth of the matter is that Napoleon won most of his battles. Washington lost most of his. As the French Revolution unfolded, I think it sent panic through the royalty of Europe, so they started to send their armies in the direction of France. But what they bumped into on the way was the French army under the leadership of a truly brilliant young general. That was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he proceeded to defeat all those other armies of the kings and emperors of Europe. Compare that to the first years of our own revolution. Specifically, let's think about the year 1776. George Washington loses the Battle of Long Island. He has to ferry his army over the East River in the dead of night just to keep it from being annihilated. He's now on Manhattan. The British storm ashore on Manhattan. They drive him right up the length of Manhattan Island. He crosses over the Hudson River into New Jersey. The British follow him. They push him right across the width of New Jersey, over the Delaware River, and into Pennsylvania. It's truly a fortunate thing for George Washington and his Continental Army that in those days the British did not like to fight during the winter months. So at that point they withdraw back toward New York and they leave him alone. But Washington really is in desperate straits. He's lost a significant part of his army to casualties and desertion. By December, winter has set in and disease starts to spread through his winter encampments. And to kind of cap it all off, most of his remaining soldiers, their terms of enlistment are up on December 31st. At that point, they can simply go home if they want to. Congress was thinking of removing him from command at that point. And he wasn't a man to show his emotions very well, but in a letter to his brother, he essentially said that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy where I am right now. But sometimes, out of desperation, comes bold action. So we come to December 24, Christmas Eve, 1776, and Washington does something. And I think you've probably all seen the painting. He crosses the Delaware River. He marches his ragtag army through the snowy woods of New Jersey. And those stories you've heard about blood in the snow, because some of the soldiers don't have shoes, those stories are true. In the early morning hours, he attacks a Hessian garrison at Trenton. Hessians are German mercenaries. They're in the employ of the king, and they're taken completely by surprise. The battle is not very long, but by the time it is over, there are only a few American casualties, and yet 900 Hessian soldiers are either dead or captured. The British now know that Washington is on the move, so they send their army in his direction. Maybe they think that they can pin him up against the Delaware River and annihilate him there. But George Washington doesn't cooperate. He moves his army in an arc around the main British force, and he attacks a smaller British garrison at Princeton. 2 quick victories. The British High Command see these 2 battles as mere skirmishes of no military or strategic importance whatsoever. But what I think they truly failed to understand is the huge impact that those 2 victories would have on American morale. Because up until about that point, most people thought that the war was just about over and the revolution was just about lost. If you read a great book by David McCulloch, it's called 1776, you really get a feel for how the news of those two victories just spread like wildfire through the 13 colonies. Washington is up there in Princeton. He's on his horse. He's got all his men lined up in columns. He's riding back and forth in front of them. And essentially, he's yelling at them. He's saying, you have done more than anybody has any right to ask of you. But I cannot spare you. I cannot continue this fight without you. Essentially, he's begging his soldiers to re-enlist. And think about it. These poor guys, they've just been through months where they're hungry and they're cold, and now they're fatigued from battle and from marching. And yet, very slowly at first, with great hesitation, men began to take one step forward from the ranks. It was their way of saying, okay, General, I'll stick with you. I'll continue this fight. And that, in a nutshell, is how George Washington not only saved his army, but he saved our revolution. So maybe that's what Napoleon was talking about there on his deathbed. Washington's great perseverance, sometime in what truly must have seemed like overwhelming odds. But you know what? I don't think that was it. Because if you study the life of Napoleon, he persevered very well himself. I think it was something else. Let's move forward to the month of March in the year of 1783. The Revolutionary War is almost over. The Battle of Yorktown has been won. There are peace negotiations going on in Paris, and Washington has gathered the bulk of his army up around the town of Newburgh, New York. There's a great big hall in the middle of town, and his officers want to hold a meeting. So 500 of them gather in this hall. And boy, are these guys mad. All through the war, for the most part, Congress did a pretty poor job of supplying the army with what it needed. Food, warm clothing, footwear, ammunition, money, so the officers could pay their soldiers. And at this point, there were rumors floating around that Congress was going to renege on the promise of pensions that it had made to the officers. So I think the men in that room were just plain fed up. And the grumblings all through that room were about marching on and overthrowing Congress and putting Washington in as head of state. Essentially, they wanted to make him king. So into this room of angry men calmly walks George Washington. He gets up in front of them and he calmly starts to talk to them. Unfortunately for history, nobody was taking notes. We really don't know for sure what words he used. We do know that early in the talk, he pulled some spectacles out of his pocket and he started to clean them with a cloth. Very few of his officers even knew that he wore spectacles. While he was doing this, he said, "Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse me. It appears that I have grown not only gray, but also nearly blind in service to my country." And then he continued his talk. And while he was talking, tears started to well up in the eyes of many of the men in that room. And this was a very tough group of men. They had just been through 8 years of war, most of them. Yet by the time Washington is done talking to them, many of them are crying. And what we also know is that after that talk, there was no more talk among his officer corps about overthrowing Congress. A number of times during the Revolution and in the years that followed, Washington, had he the inclination, could have seized absolute power, could have made himself a king. If the temptation was there at all, he resisted it. And I sometimes wonder if nowadays, here in the 21st century, we can truly appreciate that quality in the man. Because up until then, and throughout all of prior history, powerful men, when given the opportunity to seize absolute power, they seldom hesitated, not for a minute. Napoleon Bonaparte certainly didn't hesitate. When he was given that opportunity, he seized the crown, put it on his own head, and made himself emperor. Washington never did that. And I think that's what Napoleon Bonaparte was talking about. He's lying there on his deathbed. Of all the things he could have said about his own remarkable life, what words does he say? They wanted me to be another Washington.